Immediately after the murder of Kansas Dr. George Tiller, his friend and colleague, Dr. Leroy Carhart, announced that within a week, Dr. Tiller's clinic in Kansas would resume its normal schedule. That despite the efforts of those who harassed and terrorized and finally killed Dr. Tiller, his clinic would continue providing the services for which he had been vilified and harassed and shot and ultimately, it seems, killed. The Tiller family then walked back the statement from Dr. Carhart, saying that they had not actually yet made a decision on the clinic's future. One person who said he did not want the clinic to be shut down because of Dr. Tiller's killing is the president of Operation Rescue, a man named Troy Newman, who said earlier this week, quote, "Good God, do not close this abortion clinic for this reason. Every kook in the world will get some notion." But today, Dr. Tiller's family announced that they will close the clinic anyway, immediately. According to a statement from the family, quote, "We are proud of the service and courage shown by our husband and father and know that women's health care needs have been met because of his dedication and service. That is a legacy that will never die. The family will honor Dr. Tiller's memory through private, charitable activities." Of course, the Tiller family's decision is a private one, and after what they have been through, no one begrudges them making that decision. That said, we as a country are now faced with yet another victory for the anti-abortion movement generally and for anti-abortion terrorist violence specifically. A fact underscored today by Scott Roeder, the man who was accused of murdering Dr. Tiller last week. Today, Mr. Roeder did a lengthy interview from his jail cell. He called the closing of Dr. Tiller's clinic, quote, "a victory for all the unborn children." Mr. Roeder stopped short of admitting his own guilt, but he said that if he is found guilty, quote, "the entire motive was the defense of the unborn." There, of course, is a law-abiding, advocacy-driven anti-abortion movement in this country that is not to be confused with the terrorist fringe that endorses violence. But for every murder, every firebombing, every act of vandalism that happens anywhere at an abortion provider in this country, the law-abiding protesters everywhere else in the country seem that much more intimidating to a woman seeking an abortion or a doctor providing one. Because of the violence that has existed at the edges of this movement for decades, there are now only 2 providers left in this entire country of 300 million people who will do late abortions. There are only 2 left. Earlier tonight, we spoke with Dr. Susan Wicklund, who was on this show last week, to talk about the threats that she has received as a doctor who performs abortions. Dr. Wicklund phoned us tonight to tell us that the Abortion Care Network is reporting that since Dr. Tiller's murder, there has been a noticeable increase in incidents of violence and intimidation against women at abortion clinics around the country. Joining us now is Susan Hill, a friend of the late Dr. Tiller, who has opened more than a dozen clinics across the country since 1973. She's currently president of the National Women's Health Organization. Ms. Hill, first of all, let me say I'm sorry for the loss of your friend, for Dr. Tiller, and thanks for being here with us tonight.
Oh, I thank you that you invited me.
Have you seen any change in the number or the type of protests outside the clinics that you're associated with since Dr. Tiller's murder?
Oh, they've been much more aggressive, much more hostile, yelling that last Saturday they were yelling at me that I was the next to die, that they were praying for my death. There's been not only not a let-up, but a more vicious attack.
Do you, and this is, I guess, an overarching question, but also something specific about Dr. Tiller's murder, do you see this murder, do you see the acts of overt violence that we've seen against abortion providers in recent years, do you see it as essentially succeeding as a form of terrorism?
It is if we let it succeed. And for the providers who are still in this field, and they're very dedicated people, we won't let it succeed. We will figure out how to fill the void left by Dr. Tiller. We're already making plans between almost all the groups in the country. And, you know, they've been very effective, but we're still here, and we're going to be here.
How much do providers around the country communicate with each other about these specific threats of violence?
There are several groups that are sort of ad hoc groups, and we've been really communicating almost daily for years, ever since we started to be killed. We felt we had to protect ourselves, and our best way to do it was to share information.
We know that the U.S. Marshals were dispatched after this most recent murder to protect providers.
Yes.
Is that enough? Is that an appropriate response? Does it make you feel safer?
We appreciate the help from the marshals, and we've had it before after the first killings. So it makes us comfortable about the safety of our staff and our patients. But there has to be more done. I've been saying all week, you can't make people safe if the laws that are on the books are not enforced. And they haven't been enforced. They haven't been enforced since FACE was passed. And with local police departments especially, there's been a real problem, an unwillingness to enforce the laws that were written to protect the safety of women all over the country.
Which, of course, was the whole justification for creating this as a federal, for passing federal legislation
Absolutely.
In this regard.
Well, I went and testified at Congress on the FACE bill and really begged the Congress to pass it because there was no uniform enforcement all over, between cities. And whatever they could get away with not doing, they did.
Last night on this show, Frank Schaeffer, who is a veteran of the religious right and the early anti-abortion movement, and has since changed his mind about a lot of his earlier views,
yes,
said on this show that he wants to see mainstream pro-life groups and even some of the more militant pro-life groups start turning in their members when their members brag about things that would be violations of the FACE Act, things like criminal damage, things like gluing locks shut, the forms of vandalism and criminal mischief and criminal damage that were turned into federal crimes in order to try to get a handle on this overall violent movement. Do you think that would ever happen? Do you see any prospect for that sort of an effort by the pro-life movement to really take responsibility by doing something like that?
They haven't in the past. An example is Troy Newman that you quoted earlier, who was, I guess, trying to disassociate himself with this man. And yet Troy Newman has in front of our clinics harassed women and intimidated them. So I think when they get in trouble, when there's a violent act, they all run for the shadows or the corners. But they're back out in the next few months. We know they come back. I've been doing this 35 years. They know how to play the game. And for the most part, they want to come back and be as really intimidating and harassing as they can be, which is a crime against women in this country who have a right to exercise their rights.
It is quite literally a crime. Lastly, is there something that you would like to see, not only in terms of better enforcement of the existing laws, but should there be other legislation? Should there be other means of protecting providers and clinic staff?
Well, my frustration is that there are many laws already on the books, not just FACE, stalking, harassment, trespassing. These people that have been violent could have been stopped years ago if people had been willing to enforce it, and maybe a lot of these murders wouldn't have occurred.
Susan Hill is president of the National Women's Health Organization. Thank you so much for your work. Thanks for joining us tonight. And again, I'm sorry for your loss.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.